religious tension, political ambition, and a struggle for the throne of France. This is the civil war that tore France apart, involved almost every country in Europe, and led to the deaths of 3 million people. This is the French Wars of Religion. This video is part of Project France, a collaboration with a bunch of other history YouTubers with videos involving anything in French history. Check out the videos and the playlist in the description after this video. In the 14th century, France was seen as the centre of Europe. They just came off beating England in the 100 Years' War and losing in the Italian Wars. It was one of the strongest countries in Europe. Two fed-up clergymen were about to change that, John Calvin and Martin Luther.
Luther was angry at the Catholic Church because he saw people paying the church for salvation, which he believed was not only bad theology, but also corrupted the church. Calvin, coming 20 years after, took this and ran with it. He taught that not only can the church not save you, but that God has already decided whether you go to heaven or hell, but if you follow my teachings, other people will probably think you're going to heaven. This made a lot of sense to a lot of people, especially because the kings of France got the ability to appoint their own people as bishops. And a lot of them weren't exactly into it, so Calvin started to preach his own version of Christianity in the 1530s.
Skip forward about 40 years to the 1570s. Luther's influence on France was strong. Out of the 16 million people in France, 1.6 million were Protestants by the 1570s. But the government noticed this massive conversion of people, and they weren't exactly happy, but they were left alone until the affair of the placards.
On October 18, 1534, as people went to church, notes were put up around France that made fun of the idea of the Catholic Mass and Communion, and someone stuck one to the king's bedroom door while he was sleeping. King Francis saw this as a threat to his life and his authority, and so he ordered the guys who wrote it burned at the stake in front of Notre Dame. If this religion could cause people to disrespect authority this much, it wasn't that far of a stretch for someone to come and kill him. He continued to fight against any suspected treason from Protestants, and Calvin, a French Protestant, had to flee to Switzerland. He didn't stop there though. Once free from persecution, he really started to influence the French Protestants. If you want to know how John Calvin went from an upstart lawyer to the face of the French Reformation, becoming one of the most influential reformist figures in the world, you should check out my video on the life of John Calvin after this.
Which brings me to the three main players in this 30-year game of political chess: the Valois, the Guise, and the Bourbons. The Guise were one of the most powerful families in France, with a bunch of soldiers. They were heavily and militantly Catholic. The Bourbons were also one of the most powerful families in France, with a bunch of soldiers. And the Valois was the ruling family in France that tried to keep the kingdom stable and balance themselves between these two warring families. Even though Calvin left France, and the Protestants were being hunted and massacred, it still continued to spread, even after Francis died, especially because Calvin started converting some of the nobles to Protestantism, including one of the king's relatives, the Duke of Conde, Louis Bourbon. But the new king, Henry, wasn't happy with all the Protestants, and the fact they didn't follow his religion, and that meant they were all secret rebels, and so burnt even more Protestants. But when Henry died, his 14-year-old son was the next king. But he couldn't actually rule properly, but was technically old enough to, so the Duke of Guise and his brother ran the country for him. Both were heavily Catholic. But the king was naive and impressionable, and the Huguenots, the Calvinists, were still being burned at the stake. So Bourbon and some other Huguenots thought, why not just kidnap him, arrest the Duke and his brother, and then convert the king to Protestantism? Well, what happens after we kidnap the king? Oh, we'll figure it out later. Nothing can go wrong. But as they put this plan into action, one guy got drunk at a local tavern and told the whole plot. The Duke of Conde, Louis Bourbon, was arrested, and 1,500 people were killed. But Louis got off on lack of evidence and he was released. So, as all these people were getting their heads chopped off, the mother of the king was watching from the crowd. She couldn't understand why so many people would risk their lives for this, and be so desperate to actually try and kidnap the king. Maybe there was something to this Protestantism after all. This is where Catherine de Medici comes into the story. She thinks that all this hunting and killing of Protestants won't eradicate them, and considering they tried to kidnap the king, they'd be more desperate and angry for change. When the king died 9 months later and her other son, Charles, became king at age 10, she started to run the country herself. She could see that this 30 years of persecution, people were still converting, and this persecution wasn't going to solve anything. This would probably make things worse. So she sat them both down at Poissy, and this meeting can basically be summed up like this.
How much blood will spill until everybody does what they were always going to have to do from the very beginning? Sit down and talk!
The council didn't achieve anything. It was too far gone at this point, and people were way too invested in their beliefs. But to try and stop Protestant rebellions, Catherine passed legislation that made concessions to the Protestants, mostly Calvinists, but I'm going to call them Huguenots, that allowed them to worship publicly outside of towns, and also privately within their homes. 2 months after this, the Duke of Guise with his boys were going to mass in the town of Poissy, and he saw a group of Huguenots in a barn that was basically their church. His boys tried to go in the barn and started insulting them. The Huguenots pushed them out. It escalated, rocks were thrown, and somebody slapped the Duke. The Duke got angry and burned the barn down, with the Protestants inside it. And this absolute barbaric act of inhumanity and barbarity got a lot of people angry, including Louis Bourbon and his friend Gaspard de Coligny. They issued a call for Protestants to raise arms against the Catholics. And Francis, the Duke of Guise, started getting his troops in Paris to fight against the Huguenots. The Duke of Guise also sent an army up towards the court to protect the king, and with Louis Bourbon too scared to help or drive off the army, she declared the Huguenots enemies, and the war began. Bourbon and the Protestants took a bunch of cities. Guise took them back. But after Guise and some of the major commanders died in battle, no side could actually win, and after Elizabeth I started to invade France, everyone made peace to fight her off. A couple of wars happened, but neither side could actually outright win, and the Protestants got more freedom. But Louis Bourbon was killed during one of these battles, and the new Huguenot leader was his friend, Gaspard de Coligny. And after these wars, he got invited to court, and got really close to the king. Too close to the king. And after he started to agree with the Huguenots on a lot of stuff, and had a match with a Protestant queen, the Catholics at court needed to deal with Coligny. While everyone was partying after the wedding, a guy shot Coligny through the window. We don't actually know who ordered it, or if he acted alone. Coligny survived, but the Catholics at the wedding knew this was going to be bad. The Huguenots are going to try and shoot us because they thought we did this on purpose. And I don't want to die, unless we get them first. Surely nothing can go wrong, and this time we can eradicate the Huguenots once and for all. So some of the Catholics at the wedding stormed the building Coligny was in and killed him, and some of his friends, and chucked him from the window. And then, worried that the Protestants would rebel, started handing out arms to the Catholics in the city of Paris. This was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and people in other cities started hunting Protestants. 10,000 Protestants died over 3 days, and the main two Protestant leaders were arrested, and Henry Bourbon, the cousin of the king, was held prisoner at court. Pretty much everyone was horrified. Moderate Catholics, Protestants, Elizabeth I, even Ivan the Terrible was shocked when he heard the news. So, war again. But after Coligny died, the Protestants needed to regroup, and so the king's brother, along with 28,000 soldiers, went to the city of La Rochelle to siege it, against 2,000 civilians and 1,200 soldiers. Oh, this'll be easy. We can eradicate the Huguenots once and for all. Fuck, they won't surrender. I'm going to Poland to be the next king. I can't be asked to deal with this. Aren't there a lot of Protestants in Poland? Yeah. That's not going to be good for you. You probably should just make peace with France and then they'll accept you as their king. But when King Charles died, that person that just became King of Poland was now also King of France. So he went back. But he didn't have a son, and so the next in line was Henry of Navarre, one of the Protestant leaders that were currently at court. The Catholics shit themselves, and Henry Guise formed a Catholic League backed by Philip of Spain to stop Henry taking the throne, and they aimed to make Charles Bourbon his Catholic uncle, the next king of France. Henry, the current king of France, was like, I don't really mind if he becomes the next king. I just want peace in the kingdom and just to rule the kingdom. The Duke of Guise and the Catholic League said, alright, I guess we're fighting you too. Then Henry Bourbon escaped from court, and now it's the War of the Three Henrys. King Henry and Henry of Bourbon knew they were going to be outnumbered because this Catholic League was composed of a lot of Catholics from all around France, and they didn't have as much money as Philip II because their country was devastated by war, so they tried to combine forces to try and fight off the Duke of Guise and his Catholic League. But King Henry, who was in the north, didn't have enough time to link up with Henry Bourbon, who was in the south, and Henry, the Duke of Guise, isolated him in Paris. And considering there was no army in Paris except the Catholic Leagues, Guise made him pass a law that all Protestant preachers had to leave France in a month, and all Protestant civilians had to leave in 6 months. Or you would have to convert or be killed. Meanwhile, Henry Bourbon was still in the south of France, and the king and the League sent an army to crush him. While this was going on, King Henry was still angry that Guise basically held him hostage and wanted to control this league, and worried that he was going to take over the throne, had him assassinated. Guise's brother then got the king assassinated, and then Charles Bourbon, the person that the League wanted to be the next king, died. And so everybody started arguing about who the next king would be. And because nobody could really agree on anything, a lot of the nobles stopped sending troops, and they were basically immobile. Meanwhile, Henry Bourbon was on the move, and beat the Catholic League's army in a bunch of battles at Courtois, Arquus and Ivry, and then started to siege Paris. If he got Paris, he could actually claim to be the next king. But Philip II of Spain says, oh no, and sends an army to force Henry back. After 3 years of sieges and of failing to get into Paris, Henry Bourbon decides, okay, Paris is like 90% Catholic. The League wants a Catholic king, so I'll just convert into a Catholic. Paris is well worth a mass. And so he converted, and considering they had a Catholic king now, the League left. He entered France because France was basically tired of war and just wanted the war to be over. As long as he was Catholic, they just didn't want to fight another war. And so, he entered Paris and was crowned King Henry IV. Pretty much everybody was tired of war after 30 years on and off, and all the major Catholic leaders that were hardcore Catholics were dead, so there was nobody else to carry on the war, and so no war broke out after. Especially after he issued the Edict of Nantes, making it so Protestants could worship freely. And even though some Catholics were worried, he was on the throne for quite a long time, and so people were chill. So the people calm, the wars were over. Almost 100 years later, a new king is on the throne, Louis XIV, and he revoked the Edict of Nantes and started persecuting Protestants. But one man would lead the crusade against the king and the Catholic Church and their power over the French people. Voltaire. The one-man renaissance. But that's a story for next time. This was part of a collab with The Casual Historian, who covered John Calvin and his life, who was the major instigator of this wars of religion. And this was an overall collaboration with a bunch of other history YouTubers about anything in French history. A link to the playlist is in the description. Go watch them, they're all going to be great.